Chapter 1: The Spectre of Kin. The silence in the ancestral cabin was a lie. It was a vast, heavy, oppressive quiet, certainly, the kind only achieved deep within the forgotten woods of the Northwest, where the damp pine needles absorbed all sound and the nearest paved road was a 2-hour hike away. But Sena, sitting cross-legged on the worn rug, knew better. The silence was just the surface tension holding back a constant, icy torrent of disapproval. They were already here. She didn't need the moon, though it was 3 nights past full, a bruised silver coin struggling to shine through the thinning canopy, to know when the pack had gathered. She felt the temperature drop 40 degrees only within the walls of the cabin, an unnatural, spiritual cold that never touched the hearthstones or the iron kettle. She saw the light of the kerosene lamp grow brittle, bending around the shapes of those who had died here centuries ago or just last decade. The air shimmered, not with heat, but with a kind of restless, milky energy. In that spectral illumination stood her relatives, the silent, watching jury of the shifting impaired. The closest one was Lyra. Lyra, the alpha ghost, had been Sena's great-aunt, a woman of fierce pride and stoic silence in life, and an even more demanding presence in death. Lyra stood beside the stone mantelpiece, seemingly carved from the oldest, hardest snow. She wore the familiar, shimmering outline of the dress she'd been buried in thick wool, appropriate for the cold ground, but her eyes, shadowed and ancient, were fixed on Sena with the intensity of a lighthouse beam. "Still here, child," Lyra's voice scraped across the inner chambers of Sena's mind, a sound less like speech and more like the friction of frozen branches. "Still trying to cheat the blood." Sena closed her eyes tighter, digging her nails into her palms. She refused to speak back. It only encouraged them. She was attempting the most difficult and most shameful ritual of her life, the late cycle shift. Most lycanthropes, even those with weak bloodlines, felt the call of the moon like a tidal wave. They could shift fully on the 3 nights of the full moon and maybe a night or 2 before and after. Sena had never felt the wave, not even a ripple. Her body, now 22 years old, had betrayed her since puberty. Her pack, the Cairn line, were the guardians of this enormous, feral stretch of wilderness. In a pack built on primal strength, she had inherited only the curse of spectral vision, a cruel, ironic counterpoint to the power she lacked. She focused on the deep, rhythmic breathing technique her mother had once taught her, a technique meant to coax the inner beast, to open the door to the transformation. Inhale, the scent of wet earth and ancient moss. Exhale, the failure. She pushed, forcing the image of the sleek, gray wolf that should have been her second self into the forefront of her mind. She pictured the elongation of her spine, the crack of her joints, the agonizing, liberating tear of muscle as it reformed. Her muscles responded with a spasm. Her knuckles turned white and a vein stood out sharply on her neck. A searing pain shot through her shoulders, a brief, sharp promise of change. For a glorious, heartbreaking second, she thought she felt the skin tighten over her cheekbones, ready to stretch into a snout. Then nothing. The pain evaporated, replaced by the familiar, crushing weight of her human form, utterly unchanged, utterly mundane. She opened her eyes, gasping, the air in her lungs feeling thin and used up. A chorus of spectral sighs swept through the room, sounding like wind running over grave markers. "Such a waste of effort," murmured a faint voice near the ceiling. A ghost she recognized as her third cousin, a wolf whose spirit was little more than a bored teenager. "Look at her," said Lyra, tilting her spectral head. "So desperate to escape. She sees the living but yearns for the beast." Sena finally spoke, her voice thick with exhaustion and defeat. "Shut up, Lyra. You have no idea what it's like." "We know exactly what it is like," Lyra corrected, her spectral outline gaining a momentary charge of icy blue light. "We are the consequence, child. You were blessed with the eyes to see us and cursed with the blood that won't run. You are tethered to this place, to us. Accept it." Sena pushed herself up, staggering slightly. Every muscle ached, not from transformation, but from the desperate tension of forcing a biological impossibility. "The land needs protection," Sena said, running a tired hand through her short, brown hair. It was her mantra, the only thing that kept her from walking away entirely. "Not sentimentality, Lyra. I'll do my job." "Your job is to remember, Sena. Your job is to listen. The living pack is too blind and too arrogant to understand the secrets that hold them to this soil. Only you with your useless, half-formed spirit, can see the truth." Sena grabbed the iron poker and stoked the fire, relishing the way the physical heat temporarily pushed the ghosts back a few feet, making their luminous outlines indistinct. By morning, the ghosts had dimmed, sinking back into the shadows and the wood grain, becoming ambient disapproval instead of active commentators. They were always there, but their clarity faded with the sun. Sena forced herself into the routine of the living, boiling water, scrubbing the wooden floorboards, and preparing for the first light patrol of the eastern boundary. This was her true life's work, the penance she paid for her curse. She kept the homestead functioning and monitored the territory edges, using her unparalleled knowledge of the ancient land's pathways to keep the pack's existence a secret from the outside world. She was essentially a human shield, a convenient buffer between her family and the modern world. She strapped on her sturdy hiking boots, laced with double knots, and checked the heavy knife on her belt. She needed no weapons for herself. The ghosts, despite their harshness, were fiercely protective of her physical body, often moving rocks or tripping hazards out of her path. The knife was for cutting through dense brush and warding off the actual threats of the forest: bears, coyotes, and occasionally, the living pack members who might try to jump her border to prove a point. Before leaving, she looked at the map tacked above her small desk. It wasn't a standard geological map. It was covered in her own hand-drawn glyphs, circles marking where the ghost pack preferred to congregate, and triangles noting the areas where the spectral energy felt thickest, places where the ancestors had performed rituals or faced death. She tapped the eastern boundary line, a dotted, contested edge where the wild forest gave way to scattered ranch properties, and beyond that, a small, economically depressed mill town. "Eastern Ridge," she muttered, retrieving a bag of dried berries and jerky. "Rorik suspects something is moving." Lyra, who had been a hazy figure near the window, suddenly materialized with stunning clarity, her eyes flashing like chips of ice. "No, not suspicion," Lyra commanded, her voice sounding like a warning bell struck once. "Certainty. I feel the trespasser now, Senara, a blight upon the roots." "I've checked the remote cameras," Sena sighed, tying her scarf tight around her neck. "Just deer and a couple of mountain bikers. Calm down." "It is not the flesh I fear," Lyra hissed, stepping closer until the spectral cold bit into Sena's skin like frostbite. "It is the intent. This one comes to dig, to reveal, to steal the silence we paid for with our lives. He seeks the heirloom." Sena frowned. The heirloom? That's just a bedtime story, Lyra, a myth you all cling to. The heirloom was the pack's oldest legend, a relic of pure spiritual power, supposedly hidden on the land by the first alpha, the very one who had first struck the ancient, binding pact with the land that led to their strange lineage. It was the reason the ghosts were trapped, the reason her blood was cursed, and the reason her pack were powerful, land-bound wolves. Lyra's face contorted in a look of spectral fury. It is not a myth, it is the tether that keeps us whole. Go, Sena, drive out the man who seeks to uncover the soil. Do not speak to him, do not look upon him, hurt him if you must. Sena felt a chill deep in her bones, one that wasn't just the residual cold of the ghost pack. The command to hurt was unusual, even for Lyra. Usually, they just demanded isolation. This felt like genuine, desperate fear. She nodded curtly, pulling open the heavy, creaking door. The scent of pine and damp earth rushed in, a blessed, physical smell that momentarily cleared the spectral static from her mind. I will handle the boundary, Sena promised, stepping out of the shadowed cabin and into the soft, early morning light. She didn't look back at the place where the ghost of her gray-tant stood watching, ensuring she understood the seriousness of her task. Drive him out, do not speak to him, do not look upon him. It was a clear mission, and one Sena knew she had to carry out perfectly. If she failed, it wouldn't just be Rorik who punished her. It would be the eternal, overwhelming presence of the ghost pack, and she had nowhere else to go. She started jogging along the narrow, winding deer path, her mind already mapping the route, her eyes fixed on the distant promise of the eastern ridge, and the human problem she was about to confront. Chapter 2: The Mandate of the Pack. Sena altered her path. Instead of heading directly to the eastern boundary, she turned north, climbing the steep, forested slope toward the heart of the territory. She needed to report to the living pack, specifically to the current alpha, her older brother Rorik. It was a point of deep, bitter pride that the living pack never used roads. They relied on ancient, carved-out game trails, which meant Sena arrived winded, her muscles burning, but the exertion was welcome. It was honest, physical fatigue that drowned out the spectral murmurs of the ghost pack. The ancestors, who disliked movement outside their sacred perimeter, were momentarily quieted by the sheer speed of her trespass across the pack's center. The pack settlement was not romantic, it was functional. A cluster of sturdy, angular buildings made from dark, unfinished cedar, built around a communal lodge and a heavily secured arsenal. There were no ghosts here. The living pack's brute vitality seemed to repel them. It felt colder here, paradoxically, because there was no spectral warmth to break the true chill of the forest. It was an environment of stark, practical silence, governed by utility. As she approached, she saw two of her cousins working near the woodshed, sharpening axes with ruthless efficiency. They paused, watching her approach with expressions that ranged from neutral pity to faint contempt. Sena ignored them, heading straight for the Alpha's lodge, a building that was only slightly larger than the rest, but commanded the space with an intimidating permanence. Rorik was inside, sitting at a thick, scarred wooden table, reviewing a dense map of boundary markers with two of his most trusted, heavily muscled patrolmen. Rorik had inherited the Alpha position 2 years prior. He was tall, sharp-featured, and possessed the chilling calm of a man who was always in control, both of his body and his decisions. His dark clothes were practical, his focus absolute. He barely glanced up when she entered. "Sena," he said, his voice level, acknowledging her presence like a necessary administrative detail. Timely, for once. She hated that he knew her schedule and rarely deviated from it. It was another way he monitored and controlled her life without ever having to look her in the eye. "I was performing my early Eastern sweep," she reported, standing straight, "checking for signs of unauthorized passage." And Rorik's eyes remained on the map, his finger tracing a line where the forest met a sprawling field marked with a small, faded X. "The perimeter remains intact. I noted heavy deer tracks near the old juniper, but no clear sign of human activity." She omitted the spectral cold she'd felt and Lyra's furious warnings. They would only be used as proof of her increasing mental instability. Rorik finally looked up. His eyes, the exact shade of gray as winter ice, held zero familial warmth. "Your reports are always insufficient, Sena, always vague. You see too much that isn't there and too little that is." The patrolman exchanged a slight glance. Sena felt the familiar hot blush of shame. Her spectral vision, the pack's curse, was considered proof of her inadequacy. Her inability to shift was the wound, her eyes were the salt. "I use the pack standard thermal and camera traps, Rorik," she retorted, keeping her voice even. "The data is clean." "Data is for scientists," Rorik scoffed, pushing the map away. "We are wolves. We use scent, sight, and instinct. You are lacking two of the three." He stood, towering over her. The difference between them was visceral. Rorik smelled of wild musk, pine sap, and the deep, clean scent of health and power. Sena smelled only of wood smoke, old tea, and the vague, metallic tang of cold she carried from the constant spectral proximity. "I can track," she insisted, tightening her jaw. "You can walk," Rorik corrected, "and you can watch the corners we don't care about." He picked up a small, smooth piece of river stone from the desk, a marker they used for local borders, and tossed it to her. She caught it instinctively. "I have a new task for you, something more physical, less theoretical," Rorik continued, his tone softening only slightly, which was worse than his anger. "The eastern boundary, south of the juniper grove, the old cairn line. There is an anomaly. We've found evidence of heavy digging near the ancient rock formation." Sena's breath hitched. Heavy digging? It was too specific to be a coincidence. Lyra hadn't been wrong about the intent. "What kind of anomaly?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Human, well-organized. Too clean to be a careless trapper or a local punk," Rorik said, leaning a hand on the desk. "This looks like someone with resources looking for something specific. A surveyor, a geologist, worse, an archaeologist." The word archaeologist hung in the air like a physical threat. They had spent decades erasing their history from public record. An archaeologist wasn't looking for deer, they were looking for their secret. "I need you to go to that exact location. It's marked by that faded X on the map. Find the extent of the damage. And if the human is still there," he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, "you will issue a warning. A clear, physical deterrent. Make it so they pack up and leave within 24 hours, or you report back to me, and I will handle the extraction." Sena knew what Rorik's extraction meant. It meant silencing the threat permanently. "Understood," she said, gripping the river stone tight enough to hurt. This was the mandate. The living pack needed her unique talent for blending in and her lack of a shifter's signature sent to deal with the human problem quietly. She turned to leave, but as she passed the map, she heard one of the patrolmen mutter quietly to Rorik. You really trust her with this, Alpha. The Watcher has a reputation for being soft on humans. Rorik's answer was delivered in a low, cold tone, meant only for the inner circle. But Sena's spectral-tuned hearing picked up every syllable. Sena is useful because she is not one of us. She is expendable. If she gets caught, we deny her entirely, and the human problem is solved by default. If she succeeds, she's bought her pathetic place for another month. Sena walked out without a flicker of reaction, though the words felt like a fresh wound. Expendable, that was her value. Not her connection to the land, not her family name, but her sheer disposability. As she strode back down the path, now heading directly toward the eastern boundary, the spectral presence of Lyra began to bleed back into her consciousness. The ghost pack had listened to Rorik's decree, and they were amused. "Ah, the living Alpha finally finds a use for the runt," sneered a spectral voice like dry leaves rattling. "A fine distraction, this human," Lyra's voice chimed in, more focused now. "He brings the living pack to our doorstep. Drive him out, Sena. You are protecting the history, not the pathetic living bodies." She now had two masters, both demanding the same outcome, Kieran's expulsion, but for entirely different, conflicting reasons. The living pack demanded it for survival, and the ghost pack demanded it for the preservation of a deeper, darker secret. Sena finally reached the old deer trail she'd intended to take earlier. The path descended into a steep, shadowed ravine that marked the true start of the contested area. She ran her hand over the rough bark of a towering maple, feeling the subtle, cold hum of spiritual energy that ran like current through the ancient trees. She was the bridge between the two packs, the living and the dead. And the moment she found Kieran, that bridge would be the first thing to shatter. She was no longer just protecting the land. She was moving directly toward the point where her family's shame intersected with her ancestors' secrets, and where her duty would crash violently into her unexpected curiosity. She checked the time and the dwindling daylight. She'd be at Kieran's encampment just before dusk. The perfect time for an unexpected, intimidating encounter. She just hoped Rorik hadn't sent anyone else ahead. She needed to deal with the threat before her family's brute force ruined everything. Chapter 3. Sena reached Kieran's campsite just as the last of the sun's light bled from the sky, a perfect, calculated timing for an intimidation tactic. It was almost a relief to find herself in the open, away from the claustrophobic silence of the pack and the spectral cold of her cabin. The air here was filled with the honest smells of wood smoke, canvas, and damp earth. She followed the scent of a campfire, a small, carefully tended flame, to a clearing where a single, low-profile tent and a small folding table were set up. He was there, sitting on a camp stool, hunched over a large, leather-bound book and a smaller notebook filled with hurried scribbles. A headlamp cast a single, bright circle on the page, illuminating his focused expression. His clothes were practical, his hands were clean but calloused, and he had a scattering of dirt on his cheek that looked less like grime and more like an endearing badge of honor. He wasn't what she'd expected. Rorik had described a problem, the ghosts had described a threat. She had imagined something loud, intrusive, and arrogant. This man was quiet, precise, and entirely absorbed in his work. He was a scholar, not a vandal. Sena took a deep, steadying breath. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice cutting through the peaceful hum of the evening insects. Kieran flinched, his head snapping up so fast he nearly knocked his glasses off his nose. He squinted into the darkness beyond his headlamp's beam, his blue eyes wide with surprise. "Whoa, didn't hear you coming. Hello." He didn't sound startled so much as intrigued. His politeness disarmed her immediately. She'd expected a blustering retort or a defensive challenge. "This is private land. You're not supposed to be here," she repeated, stepping into the edge of the light. His gaze finally landed on her, and his surprise turned to polite confusion. "Oh, I have a permit. It's for an archaeological survey, a grant through the university. I filed all the paperwork weeks ago. It was supposed to clear with a Mr. Roberts at the county office." Sena's heart sank. A permit? Rorik hadn't mentioned a permit. The pack likely hadn't bothered to check the county records, relying instead on their territorial instinct and the ghost's warnings. The legal ground for her intimidation tactic had just vanished. "The county doesn't govern this land," she said, though the words tasted like ash. "It belongs to my family." Kieran's forehead wrinkled in genuine confusion. "Your family? I'm sorry, but the records indicated it was a land trust. The owner's name was just listed as a corporation." He gestured vaguely at the book on his lap. "I'm digging into the historical use, not the legal ownership. I'm trying to find evidence of the pre-colonial settlement that was rumored to exist here, the one that vanished without a trace." He was looking for the very people whose secrets she was meant to protect. A wave of cold, spectral rage washed over her, making the hairs on her arms stand on end. The ghost pack had arrived, attracted by her direct contact with the trespasser. She could feel their fury and almost palpable heat behind the chill they emanated. Tell him nothing, drive him away. This is the one. This is the one who seeks the heirloom. Lyra's voice scraped inside Sena's mind, sharper and colder than ever. "Look, I can show you the paperwork," Kieran offered, reaching for a small satchel. "I don't want any trouble. My name is Kieran, by the way." "Sena," she replied, her voice clipped. She didn't want to give him her name, but instinct took over. The part of her that ached for human connection responded despite the protests of every other part of her. "Sena, it's nice to meet you. I'm sorry if I startled you." He gestured vaguely at the empty forest. "It's, pretty quiet out here. I'm not used to having company." Sena felt a pang of unexpected sympathy. He was alone, just like she was, but his isolation was by choice. He could leave any time. Hers was a curse. She decided to try her original, non-physical plan, make the place seem uninviting. "People who stay in these woods, they go missing," she said, leaning against a tree trunk and crossing her arms. "The legends say the land is haunted. Spirits, wild animals, things that don't want to be found." Kieran's expression didn't change to fear. Instead, a fascinated gleam appeared in his eye. "The legends? Yes, I've read about those. They're a big reason I chose this site. Are you saying you believe in them?" Sena felt her carefully constructed barrier begin to crumble. He was intrigued, not scared. His academic mind was seeing her intimidation as a source of valuable folk history, not a genuine threat. The ghost pack was roaring in her head now, their spectral voices rising in a furious clamor that was almost painful. "Believe what you want," she said, her voice hard. She had to cut this short. "My family has lived here for generations, and we don't like company. My brother, the alpha of the pack, especially doesn't. You need to leave." The use of the word alpha was a desperate attempt to use the truth as an intimidation tactic, but it was a half-truth that still felt safer than revealing their true nature. The ghosts hated it. Weakness, they screamed, but the living pack would understand the threat. Kieran's expression finally shifted, this time to mild concern. An alpha? Is he a leader of a hunting group, maybe? A local militia? The ghost pack's roars of frustration rose to a fever pitch. Sena could almost see Lyra holding her head in her hands in spiritual agony. This was going spectacularly wrong. She wasn't driving him out. She was drawing him closer to the very secret she was meant to protect. "Something like that," Sena said curtly. "He's not a forgiving man, and he knows you're here." "I see." Kieran nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Well, I appreciate the warning, but I have permits, and I'm just here to study the past. If your family is the reason for the legends, maybe you could help me. It would make my research much easier." Sena stared at him, unable to form a coherent thought. Her family was the reason for the legends. Lyra was the reason for the whispers. The ancient cairn he wanted to dig was the location of the heirloom. He had inadvertently, in a single conversation, stumbled upon every single secret her pack had spent centuries hiding. "I can't help you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The spectral cold was so intense that her teeth were beginning to chatter. "You need to leave, please, before it's too late." Kieran must have seen the genuine distress on her face. He put his book down, his earlier academic curiosity giving way to human concern. "Are you okay, Sena? You look like you're freezing." The question, so simple and so kind, was her final undoing. Her walls, so carefully constructed over a lifetime of loneliness, came crashing down. Here was a stranger who saw her distress and asked her name. She had been sent to scare him, but instead she was terrified herself, not of him, but of the things her family and ancestors would do if she failed. And in this moment, she had failed completely. Sena turned and ran, not back to her cabin, but into the deep, dark woods, leaving Kieran standing alone in the circle of his headlamp's light, a bewildered look on his face. She didn't look back. The ghost pack's cold fury was now chasing her through the trees, a punishing presence that would haunt her all the way home. Chapter 4: The False Steward. The cabin, usually her refuge from the judgment of the living, was now an engine of spiritual malice. Sena barely made it through the door before the full fury of the ghost pack descended upon her. She didn't have to see them clearly. She felt the oppression like a physical blanket of lead. The kerosene lamp, which she'd left burning low, flared wildly and then blew out with a soft, final pop. The spectral cold was suffocating, colder than any deep freeze, a bone-deep ache that carried the unmistakable scent of their spiritual wrath. Objects began to move, not violently, but with chilling deliberateness. Her leather satchel slid across the floor, kicked by an invisible foot. A stack of firewood tumbled from the bin. The lid on the cast-iron kettle rattled, though the water inside had gone cold hours ago. "You ran," Lyra's voice hissed, clear and sharp, right next to Sena's ear. "You showed fear. You ran from a human with soft hands and a piece of paper. You dishonor the blood." Sena slammed the door shut and leaned her weight against it, fighting to catch her breath. "I didn't run. I retreated. He has permits, Lyra. I couldn't just attack him. Rorik's patrolmen would be on me for assault, and then the legal chaos would bring a dozen more like him. Rorik's cowardice is not our problem. The human is a seeker. His intent is poisonous. He seeks the binding truth, the heirloom that tethers us to this earth. You were commanded to deter him." Lyra manifested fully now, standing between Sena and the dead hearth, her outline shimmering with furious, icy light. Running was the most deterrent thing I could do. I looked terrified. I sounded unhinged. He thinks I'm a crazy, freezing local who hates him, Sena argued, pulling off her heavy coat. She needed to think, to strategize. The living Pack's methods were brute force, which she lacked. The ghost Pack's methods were spiritual terror, which only worked on her. She needed subtlety. I need to control the situation, Lyra. Not burn it down, Sena insisted, rubbing her arms. Rorik called me expendable. If I use violence, I become his bait. I need to get him to leave without creating a scandal the Pack can't hide. The spectral alpha tilted her head, considering the argument with a detached, ancient cunning. Control, a human's concept. How will a bloodless girl control a man who sees spirits as history? Sena walked over to her desk, ignoring the spectral cold that followed her like a shadow. She pulled out the large, hand-drawn map, the one covered in her glyphs marking the spiritual boundaries and historical burial sites. The ghost Pack instantly crowded around her, their luminous forms bending over the table. He is an archaeologist, Sena said, her mind working furiously, translating her fear into a plan. He is guided by history, by clues. If I can't scare him, I must mislead him. I must be the false steward. She tapped a section of the map far to the southwest of Kieran's camp. This was an ancient quarry site, a mineral-rich vein that the ancestors had used centuries ago for tool making, but which held no secrets, no spiritual power, and no connection to the heirloom. It was archaeologically interesting, but utterly benign. I will give him a better story, Sena declared, her voice firming. I'll give him an alternate theory based on my family's legends. I'll make him believe his real prize is over there. She jabbed her finger at the quarry location. He'll spend a week digging in dry earth, find some harmless artifacts, and leave satisfied, thinking he's solved the mystery, leaving the real secrets here with us. The silence that followed was not one of agreement, but of contemplation. Even the ghosts knew the value of a well-executed lie. Lyra finally spoke, her voice still laced with suspicion. You will go back to him. You will willingly spend time in his sun-warmed presence. I have to, Sena said, meeting the spectral alpha's gaze. I need to be convincing. I need to give him details, local knowledge that only a true ancestral guardian would possess. I will be the guide who leads the intruder off the cliff. He thinks I'm a fascinating local resource. I will use that against him. A faint, spectral smile, cold and utterly unsettling, stretched Lyra's transparent lips. Intriguing, a trap of knowledge. Very well, Senara. If you must soil yourself with his presence, let it be for a worthy result. But know this, you try this one deception, and you will not have another chance. If he gets any closer to the true line, I will stop him myself, and you will be utterly and permanently alone. Sena spent the rest of the night reviewing her map, sketching diagrams of the quarry site, and inventing plausible folklore about mineral deposits and migrating game, preparing her performance as the local history expert. The next morning, the spectral cold receded to its usual background hum of disapproval. Sena dressed quickly, tying her hair back tighter than usual. She felt strangely energized. The isolation was still there, but now it was purposeful. She had a mission that relied on her wits, not her strength. She arrived back at Kieran's camp late in the morning. He was sitting at his folding table, but this time, he wasn't digging. He was staring at a specific page in his historical notebook with a look of utter, academic defeat. She walked into the clearing, quieter this time, but making sure he heard her approach. Kieran jumped, startled, but his immediate expression was relief, not fear. "Sena, thank God, I was worried about you. You looked ill last night. I almost packed up and left, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon this line of inquiry." Sena kept her face carefully neutral, projecting a cool, strained air of resilience. "I told you the land is intense. It doesn't like intruders. It makes people sick. I'm better now. But I need to be clear, Kieran. I am still the caretaker of this area. And if you're going to be digging here, I need to know exactly what you're doing and where." She was stepping directly into the role of the false steward. Kieran practically jumped up to show her the notebook. "I was hoping you'd come back. Look at this. I found a reference in an old county survey from the 1880s. It references a local legend about a stone of binding near the confluence of the two watchers. Does that mean anything to you? I've checked all the old maps, and there are dozens of stream junctions." Sena leaned over the notebook. The ghost pack immediately swarmed closer, their spectral outlines brightened by the proximity to the secret. Stone of binding. That was a coded reference to the heirloom, the spiritual epicenter of their lineage, located precisely where Kieran's camp was now situated. "Yes," Sena said, her voice dropping into a low, confidential tone. "It means something, but you're looking in the wrong direction. That stone isn't about this hill. It's about the oldest settlement." She stepped to the edge of the clearing, gesturing vaguely toward the southwest. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the Stone of Binding. It was a place where they performed ceremonies to ensure the iron stayed strong for their tools. It was near the old quarry site, where the red earth meets the running water." She paused, making eye contact, giving him a look of deep, shared local knowledge. "The confluence of the two watchers is two streams that drain that old mine. The local term for the mineral deposit they were mining, it was called binding ore. It's a trick of the local history. People confuse the ore with the spiritual binding. The real history isn't here, it's over there." Kieran stared at her, then back at his notes, his scholarly defeat melting into electric excitement. "Binding ore, a confusion of terminology. That makes perfect sense. All the samples I've taken here are sedimentary, not metamorphic. If I go to that quarry site, I should find evidence of sustained, long-term habitation. It's a better dig site." He grabbed her hands in a moment of sheer, academic joy. His touch was warm, human, and wonderfully solid. "Sena, this is brilliant. This is exactly the kind of local insight I needed. You're a lifesaver." Sena pulled her hands back quickly, not because the ghost pack was reacting yet, but because the intense warmth of his skin sent a sudden, unwelcome jolt of pure human feeling straight through her. She was supposed to be tricking him, but she had just experienced a flash of genuine, shared excitement. She had successfully diverted the archaeologist and bought her pack crucial time. But in doing so, she had established a new, far more dangerous dynamic, a partnership built entirely on a captivating, intellectual lie. "Just get the samples you need," Sena said, turning back toward the woods. "And when you're done, you leave. That's the deal." Kieran was already pulling his stakes, his head buzzing with new coordinates. "Deal, but thank you, Sena. I would have wasted weeks here. You're an incredible steward of this land's secrets." Sena jogged back toward the pack lands, her mission accomplished. The ghost pack was momentarily silent, pleased by the deception. But Sena felt a strange, thrilling disquiet. She had convinced Kieran that she was the false steward, but in the process, she had accidentally revealed a genuine intellectual connection to the one person she was supposed to chase away. She knew she would have to go back to see him again, not to patrol, not to scare, but to guide the lie. And every moment she spent near him was a step closer to catastrophe. Chapter 5: Echoes in the Dirt. For the next 3 days, Sena lived a double life. By day, she was the diligent false steward, the fiercely knowledgeable local who helped Kieran unpack the historical significance of the ancient quarry site, miles away from the real secrets. By night, she was the silent sentinel, using the exhaustion of her physical labor to drown out the spectral clamor of the ghost pack, who were growing increasingly smug about her successful deception. The physical distance between Kieran's new dig site and the ancestral cabin was a welcome relief. The spectral cold of the ghost pack faded quickly once she was a mile or two away from the core of the haunting, giving Sena stretches of blessed, natural quiet. Kieran had moved his entire camp, tent, table, and core sampling equipment to the quarry location Sena had cleverly redirected him toward. The new site was visually impressive, a sweeping, open expanse where iron-rich rock met a fast-moving tributary, lending credibility to the binding ore myth she had fabricated. "See," Kieran said on the third afternoon, kneeling beside a freshly dug trench, excitement vibrating in his voice. "You were right. The ferrous content here is off the charts. It's not just a quarry, it's an industrial hub for this vanished culture. This is going to rewrite the timeline of settlement in this region." Sena watched him, leaning against a rough boulder. He worked with a focused intensity that was compelling. He wasn't looking for gold or treasure, he was looking for understanding. He carefully cataloged a handful of crude, ancient stone tools, chisel points, and hand axes that were genuinely artifacts, just not the ones tied to the pack's deeper secrets. "My grandmother called this place the Scar," Sena offered, pulling a piece of manufactured lore from the air. "She said the old people took what they needed, but always replaced it with a promise." Kieran scribbled the phrase furiously into his notebook. "The Scar, beautiful, it speaks to a respect for resource management. That promise, that's what I'm looking for. A connection, a signature." They fell into a rhythm. Kieran would uncover an artifact, and Sena would provide a plausible, mystical-sounding local context. She was playing a dangerous game, building a mountain of convincing lies that she knew would eventually crumble, but with every shared joke and every moment of intellectual synergy, the relief of not being entirely alone deepened her deception. The relationship was shifting from adversarial to collaborative, defined by a shared, rigorous pursuit of historical truth, even if Sena's truth was a calculated fabrication. She found herself smiling more easily around him. Kieran was the first human in her adult life who looked at her with interest instead of pity or contempt. The trouble began unexpectedly late that afternoon, far from the quarry. Kieran insisted on walking her part of the way back to her cabin. It was purely platonic, a moment of winding down after the day's hard work, talking about his plans for carbon dating the oldest tool fragments. They stopped at a section of the main tributary, the one that defined the true, spiritual perimeter of the haunting. It was a beautiful spot, a narrow gorge where the water rushed over smooth, flat stones. Kieran took a small water sample, then pointed across the stream to a large, moss-covered rock formation. It was a towering, angular piece of granite, half hidden by ancient pines. "That," Kieran said, adjusting his glasses, is why I chose this area initially. That granite is highly unusual for this geology. It's like it was dropped here or specifically sought out. It doesn't belong. Sena instantly froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The ghost pack, the nexus. That granite formation, which they had been carefully avoiding, was the confluence of the two watchers, the true heart of the pack's spiritual territory and the supposed hiding place of the stone of binding. Lyra had warned her that the ghosts were tethered to this place, and this was the precise epicenter of that tether. Before Sena could formulate a distraction, the air around the rock formation across the stream began to shimmer. It was more than just the usual spectral haze. It was a dense, localized energy surge. Sena's vision sharpened violently, the trees momentarily turning into faint, transparent silhouettes as her eyes focused on the spiritual reality. Across the stream, on the base of the massive granite, the ghost pack was actively gathering. They were not watching her. They were focused on the rock itself, their spectral forms intensely luminous, radiating a furious, icy blue. Then the surge peaked. Sena gasped, clutching her chest. It was not a chill she felt, but a sickening, dizzying sense of temporal displacement. The scene warped. Kieran stood frozen, staring at the rock unaware. Sena saw the historical echo. For a heart-stopping moment, the past overlaid the present. The mossy granite disappeared, replaced by a raw, freshly carved stone, slick with water. A dozen figures, human in form but rippling with an intense, untamed energy, stood around it. They were her ancestors, dressed in rough hide and carrying crude weapons, their faces contorted in expressions of fear and terrible resolve. They were burying something in a deep fissure at the base of the rock, not an object, but a large, heavy stone slab covered in ancient script. The sight was quick, brutal, and utterly clear. The slab wasn't an heirloom of power. It was a pact, a binding mechanism. And as the ancestor hammered the final rock into place, their face was etched with absolute despair. The vision snapped back. The granite was once again mossy, silent, and ancient. Kieran remained rooted in place, staring. "Did you see that?" Kieran whispered, not to Sena, but to the rock. He took a nervous step back. "Did you feel that?" It was a pulse, a strange pressure. The air just thickened. Sena's spectral vision blurred, and a blinding wave of lightheadedness crashed over her. She stumbled back a step. The physical shock of witnessing the historical trauma of her ancestors was overwhelming. "That's one of the legends, Kieran," she choked out, her voice raspy. She had to deny what he felt, but her exhaustion made the lie weak. "The land doesn't like noise near its water. It's geological feedback, nothing more." She immediately spun on her heel, pulling away from the river, away from the granite, away from the spectral truth she had just witnessed. "Sena, wait," Kieran called out, following her. It was too distinct to be just geology. It felt like energy, like the ground was trying to tell me something. He caught up to her, placing a hesitant hand on her shoulder. "Listen, you're pale, you're shivering. I know you're trying to protect this land, but whatever's going on here, it's not just a myth. Your own stories confirm it. What is at that rock formation? What did your grandmother really tell you about the stone of binding?" He wasn't scared anymore. He was intensely, academically focused. He had felt the edge of the spiritual reality, and it had only fueled his need to dig deeper. Sena leaned against a tree, trying to steady her breathing. The ghost pack's presence began to coalesce again, faint and distant, but clearly moving toward the river. "I can't tell you," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear, not of him, but of the truth she now held. The heirloom wasn't a magic relic. It was a physical script, a binding truth that explained the curse and imprisoned the ghosts. And Kieran was exactly where he needed to be to find it. Her deception had failed, spectacularly, by redirecting him to the right area instead of the right lie. The ghost pack was now watching her fail, waiting for her to betray the living pack or betray her own heart.